On January 30th, 1889, the heir to the glittering Austro-Hungarian Empire was found dead in a remote hunting lodge. He was 30 years old. Beside him lay the body of his teenage mistress. His name was Crown Prince Rudolf, and the shot that killed him fired a crack into the foundation of a 600-year-old dynasty, setting in motion a chain of events that would ultimately lead to the First World War. This is the story of how a man with the world at his feet, the most fortunate heir in Europe, chose a bullet over a throne. It's not a simple political history, but a psychological mystery. How does a brilliant, forward-thinking reformer, a man who saw the future coming, end up a drug-addicted, diseased failure who murders a 17-year-old girl before killing himself? That tragic end was inevitable, for Rudolf was a man crushed between two irreconcilable worlds, the world of his father and the world of his mother. They were, in every conceivable way, oil and water. They were the two opposing forces that would pull their son apart. First, his father, Emperor Franz Joseph I. Imagine a man who is the state. He wasn't just a ruler, he was an institution. He ascended to the throne in 1848, a year of violent revolutions that nearly tore his empire apart. He was just 18 years old, and this baptism by fire forged his entire personality. For Franz Joseph, the word duty was not a concept, it was a religion. He woke before dawn, sat at his desk for hours, a bureaucrat in chief who read every document, signed every order. He wore the simple, stiff uniform of a soldier, even at his desk. He saw his empire not as a collection of peoples, but as a vast machine, and he was its chief operator. Franz Joseph was a man of the past. He distrusted emotion, he despised change, and he feared new ideas. He believed in order in the army and in the Catholic Church. He had already endured profound personal tragedy. His brother, Maximilian, had been executed in Mexico after a disastrous attempt to make him an emperor there. Such events did not soften Franz Joseph. They hardened him. They confirmed his belief that the world was a dangerous place and that only rigid adherence to tradition could keep it from collapsing. This was the man who would be Rudolf's father. He didn't want a son. He wanted an heir, a perfect copy of himself, forged in iron and discipline. And then there was his mother, Empress Elizabeth, known to the world as Sisi. If Franz Joseph was the iron cage of the monarchy, Sisi was the beautiful wild bird trapped inside it. She was a Bavarian duchess married to the emperor in a fairy tale romance when she was just 16. But she hated the Vienna court. She hated its rigid etiquette, its prying eyes, and its suffocating rules. Sisi was a thoroughly modern woman, a restless spirit trapped in an ancient system. She was obsessed with her beauty, maintaining a legendary punishing regimen of diet and exercise. She spent hours brushing her ankle-length hair, but this obsession was a symptom of her unhappiness, a way to control the one thing that was truly hers, her own body. She was a poet writing melancholic verses about her unhappiness. She was a restless traveler, constantly fleeing Vienna on her imperial yacht, seeking freedom in Hungary and Greece, in any place that was not the Hofburg Palace. She was also an intellectual. She admired the liberal poet Heinrich Heine and the democratic ideals that were sweeping Europe. She felt a deep kinship with Hungary, one of the empire's most rebellious territories, and she was instrumental in granting them more autonomy. But to her son, Rudolf, she was a fleeting, almost magical presence. She adored him, but she was too consumed by her own demons and her own quest for freedom to be a constant mother. She gave Rudolf her restless heart, her sharp intellect, and her profound skepticism of the very system he was born to rule. So, this was the genetic and emotional inheritance of the boy born on August 21st, 1858. He received his father's title, his father's crown, but he received his mother's soul. And in 19th century Austria, this was a recipe for catastrophe. The world Rudolf was born into was not the stable, unchanging monolith his father believed it to be. It was an age of profound, violent transformation. Just as Rudolf was learning to walk halfway across the world, the United States was tearing itself apart in its Civil War. From 1861 to 1865, President Abraham Lincoln was fighting to hold his Union together, a war waged over ideals of freedom, industry, and national identity. This was no distant, irrelevant event. The same forces that fueled the American conflict, nationalism, liberalism, the clash between old agricultural societies and new industrial power, were simmering right beneath the glittering surface of Franz Joseph's empire. The Austro-Hungarian Empire wasn't truly one nation. It was a mosaic of peoples: Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Poles, Slovaks, Croats, Serbs, Italians. All were forced together under the Habsburg crown, and all of them, inspired by new ideals, were beginning to dream of their own nations. While Lincoln fought to preserve one union, Franz Joseph was struggling to hold his multinational union together. His empire was losing wars. It lost bloody conflicts against France and Italy in 1859, and it would soon suffer a humiliating defeat by the rising power of Prussia in 1866. The empire was seen as a sick man of Europe, a relic from the past. This was the world that awaited the young prince. It was a world that didn't need another rigid, traditional emperor. It needed a visionary, a reformer, a healer. And Rudolf's education would, paradoxically, shape him to be that visionary, while his father's court would do everything in its power to stop him. Franz Joseph, a man who believed in breaking, not bending, had a very specific plan for his son. He would forge him into a soldier, just as he had been forged. He would burn away all of his mother's dreaminess and softness with the fire of military discipline. When Rudolf was just 7 years old, his father dismissed his beloved nurses and tutors and placed his education and his life in the hands of one man, Count Leopold Gondrecourt. This is a name you may not know, but it is perhaps the single most important key to understanding Rudolf's entire psychology. Gondrecourt was not a teacher, he was a tormentor. He was a brutal, hard-bitten military man who believed that fear was the greatest educational tool. He subscribed to a philosophy of toughening up the prince, but his methods were nothing short of systematic torture. Imagine being a small, sensitive, intelligent boy. Gondrecourt would wake Rudolf in the middle of the night by firing pistols into the air in his bedroom, shouting that the palace was under attack. He would drill him for hours until the boy nearly collapsed from exhaustion. In the dead of winter, he forced Rudolf to stand at attention in the freezing cold and rain in the palace courtyards, testing his endurance. On hunting trips, he would abandon the boy alone in the woods, forcing him to find his own way back in terror. This wasn't education. This was psychological trauma. And it was all done with the full approval of the emperor, his father. Rudolf became a nervous wreck. He was pale, sickly, prone to night terrors, and terrified of his own shadow. He wasn't becoming a soldier. He was being broken. This brutal regime continued for nearly 2 years. Rudolf was fading physically and mentally. It was his mother, Cece, who finally discovered the true extent of Gondrecourt's methods. Cece, so often absent, so often dismissed as a flighty, apolitical figure, was suddenly galvanized into a lioness. She saw what was being done to her son, the only person in the court who truly shared her spirit. In 1865, she did the unthinkable. She delivered a formal ultimatum to her husband, the emperor. It was a shocking act of defiance against the most powerful man in their world. She wrote a memorandum, a list of demands. In it, she stated in no uncertain terms that she would take full and complete control over her son's upbringing. She would choose his tutors, she would oversee his household, she would manage his health, and her final, non-negotiable demand, Count Gondricourt must be dismissed immediately. If the emperor refused, she would leave the court, and the world would know why. Franz Joseph was stunned. He was trapped between his iron-willed wife and his iron-willed idea of duty. But the scandal of the Empress leaving him was too great, even for an emperor. He relented. Gondricourt was fired. Sisi had saved her son's life, but in doing so, she had set him on a new path, one that would lead to a different, more profound collision. She had saved him from his father's brutal methods, but she had also inadvertently armed him for a devastating ideological war against his father's beliefs. Sisi replaced the tormentor with a new team, led by a liberal-minded man, Count Joseph Latour von Thurnberg. And most importantly, she hired a new tutor for Rudolf's academic studies, Joseph von Lerchenfeld. These men were the complete opposite of Gondricourt. They were humanists, intellectuals, and progressives. Suddenly, Rudolf's world exploded. The boy who had been forced to stand in the rain was now immersed in the great ideas of the age. He was no longer just drilling. He was learning. He devoured subjects. He showed a brilliant, quick mind. He learned to speak German, Hungarian, Czech, and French with astonishing fluency. He wasn't just learning languages to rule. He was learning them to understand the peoples of his empire. He developed a passionate, lifelong interest in science, particularly ornithology, the study of birds. Think about that for a moment. The boy, who was supposed to be a soldier, a symbol of a static empire, found his passion in the study of flight, of migration, of freedom. He would later write and publish respected scientific papers on the subject. He was a true intellectual, a man of the new 19th century scientific mind. And crucially, his tutors, with Sisi's full blessing, introduced him to liberal philosophy. He read books that his father would have considered dangerous, even treasonous. He learned about constitutional monarchies, about the rights of the people, about the necessity of reform. He began to see his father's empire not as a glorious machine, but as an antiquated prison, suffocating the nationalities within it. He developed a deep, passionate love for Hungary, just as his mother had, seeing in its independent spirit a model for the future. This was the great paradox. His mother had saved him. His education had enlightened him. But together they had turned him into the one thing his father could never, ever accept: a coffeehouse intellectual, a journalist, a dreamer. He was now a man with a modern, progressive brain, trapped in the body of a medieval heir. He adored his mother, but she remained a distant, glittering star. He wanted to respect his father, but he fundamentally disagreed with every single thing his father stood for. Brilliant, charismatic, and forward-thinking, Rudolf seemed destined for greatness. And by the time he reached his late teenage years, he was completely and utterly alone. He was an alien in his own home, the Hofburg Palace, a brilliant heir trapped by his own intellect. The stage was now set for a lifetime of political frustration and profound personal conflict. By his 20s, Crown Prince Rudolf had become a man forged in paradox, educated by liberals, ruled by a conservative. His father, Emperor Franz Joseph, demanded duty, silence, and obedience. His mother, Empress Sisi, offered him a poetic, rebellious soul, but remained a beautiful, distant star, always traveling, always fleeing the very world she had brought him into. So what does a brilliant, passionate, and profoundly frustrated young man do in such a situation? He does what all trapped people do. He builds a second life. By day, Rudolf was the crown prince. He wore the immaculate white uniform. He stood beside his father at mind-numbing military parades. He attended silent, suffocatingly formal family dinners where the only sound was the scraping of silverware. But by night, Rudolf disappeared. He would slip out of the palace, often in plain civilian clothes, and dive into the real Vienna. He went to the cafes, the intellectual and artistic heart of the empire. These were the places where new ideas were born, where revolution was debated over coffee and cake, where poetry, science, and politics all crashed together. Imagine the scene: the heir to the Habsburg throne, the future emperor, sitting in a smoky corner, a glass of wine in hand, arguing passionately until 2 a.m. And who was he arguing with? Not with dukes and archdukes. No, his chosen friends were the very people his father's government spied on. They were journalists, poets, liberal politicians, and scientists. He was witty, he was charming, he was intense. People were drawn to his magnetism, to the shocking thrill of hearing the future emperor speak with such radical passion. This wasn't just youthful rebellion, like a college student sneaking out. This was a profound and dangerous act of defiance. He wasn't just learning about the world, he was breathing it in, desperate for a taste of real life, of authenticity that the cold, sterile palace could never offer. His closest friend, his most important confidant, was perhaps the most dangerous man he could have possibly chosen: Moritz Scheps. Scheps was the editor and owner of the Neues Wiener Tagblatt, the most powerful liberal newspaper in Vienna. He was a brilliant writer, a passionate advocate for reform, and he was Jewish. We cannot overstate how explosive this friendship was. The imperial court of Franz Joseph was deeply conservative, aristocratically proud, and profoundly Catholic. It was also, like much of Europe at the time, riddled with a casual systemic anti-Semitism. For the crown prince to not only associate with a liberal journalist, but to make a Jewish liberal journalist his primary mentor and friend was a scandal of the highest order. It was a slap in the face to his father's entire worldview. But Rudolf didn't care. In Scheps, he had found what he couldn't find in his father: a teacher, a true intellectual partner. The two would meet and talk for hours. Rudolf, starved for political influence, used Scheps as his unofficial advisor. He would float his ideas, his political theories, and Scheps would give him an honest, unfiltered perspective from outside the palace walls. The court, led by the iron-fisted prime minister, Eduard Taffe, watched this friendship with growing horror. They saw Scheps as a puppet master, a radical corrupting the prince. They began to spy on Rudolf, to intercept his letters, to build a wall around him. But the more they tried to isolate him, the more Rudolf rebelled. Rudolf's frustration was building. He had all these ideas, all this energy, but his father refused to give him any meaningful role in the government. Franz Joseph, who had been on the throne since 1848, still treated his 20-something son like a child. Rudolf was given token military commands, sent to open exhibits, but he was kept completely shut out of the real chambers of power. He was an heir in name only, a glorified mascot. So if his father wouldn't give him a voice, he would take one. He began a secret career. Rudolf, Crown Prince of Austria-Hungary, became an anonymous journalist. This was his ultimate rebellion. Using a variety of pseudonyms, most famously Julius Felix, he began to write articles, pamphlets, and essays, and he had his friend Moritz Scheps publish them. And these weren't gentle suggestions for reform. They were blistering, full-throated attacks on his own father's government. Imagine the emperor opening his morning newspaper and reading an anonymous article that powerfully argues that his entire foreign policy is a disaster. An article that says the empire's new alliance with Bismarck's Germany, the very Germany that had humiliated Austria in war just years before, is a fatal mistake, a suicide pact that ties the diverse Austrian Empire to a rigid militaristic Prussian state. Imagine him reading that the true future for Austria lies not with Germany, but with a new alliance of the oppressed, with France and with Russia. This wasn't just a different opinion. In the eyes of Franz Joseph, this was treason. And Rudolf didn't stop there. He wrote passionately in defense of the rights of the many ethnic groups in the empire. He argued that the Czechs, the Poles, the Slavs deserved the same rights and autonomy that his mother had helped win for the Hungarians. He was, in effect, calling for the complete dismantling of his father's centralized, German-dominated system and replacing it with a United States of Austria, a federal empire. He saw this as the only way the empire could survive the coming 20th century. His father saw it as a recipe for chaos and dissolution. The emperor, of course, knew the secret police were efficient. He knew his own son was the Julius Felix attacking him in the press. The confrontation, when it came, was brutal. Franz Joseph forbade him from publishing, forbade him from seeing Seps. The relationship between father and son, already strained, now became a cold, silent war, fought inside the suffocating walls of the palace. Rudolf was forced to take a step back from his anonymous political attacks, but he poured his energy into one vast official project that he managed to get his father to approve, perhaps because it seemed purely academic. He became the chief editor and sponsor of a massive 24-volume encyclopedia called the Austro-Hungarian Monarchy in word and picture. This may sound dry and academic, but in Rudolf's hands it was a quiet, revolutionary act. This wasn't a book about the Habsburg dynasty, or its battles, or its generals. This was a book about the people. It was a sweeping, detailed, and deeply respectful portrait of all the ethnic groups, traditions, cultures, and languages within the empire. He commissioned scientists, artists, and writers from all backgrounds, German, Hungarian, Czech, Jewish, to contribute. It was his love letter to the multicultural empire he dreamed of leading. It was his way of saying we are strong because of our diversity, not in spite of it. It was the exact opposite of his father's German-first policy. It was a monumental, brilliant, and ultimately tragic vision of a future that would never come to pass. While Rudolf was secretly trying to save his empire, his father was focused on the one thing that truly mattered to a 19th century monarch: succession. Rudolf was a political radical, yes, but more importantly, he was unmarried. He had no heir, and for Franz Joseph, this was the great crisis. The dynasty required a son, and a son required a wife. And so began the cold, political, and deeply unromantic process of the bride hunt. This was not about love. It was a merger, a contract. Rudolf, the passionate intellectual, the man who craved authentic connection, was now forced to inspect Europe's royal daughters like a farmer inspecting livestock. The list was short. She had to be Catholic, she had to be royal, and her family had to be politically acceptable. He traveled. He met princesses from Spain and Portugal, but nothing came of it. He was cynical, writing to his tutors that he knew this was his duty, a bitter pill he had to swallow. He felt the cage of his destiny closing in. And then, in Brussels, he was presented with a candidate. She was just 16 years old, the daughter of the notoriously ambitious and brutal King Leopold II of Belgium. Her name was Princess Stephanie. Stephanie was in every way a tragic figure, a different kind of victim in this same dynastic game. She was not a brilliant intellectual. She had not been raised with an Sisi-like spirit of freedom. She had been raised in the cold, loveless Belgian court, educated in a strict convent. She was taught obedience, piety, and duty. She was plain, a little awkward, and utterly, terrifyingly naive. She knew nothing of the world, nothing of men, and certainly nothing of the complex, cynical, and politically treacherous court of Vienna. Rudolf was not in love. He couldn't be. They had absolutely nothing in common. He was a 22-year-old world-weary radical intellectual. She was a 16-year-old convent goose, as he sometimes cruelly, privately referred to her. But she checked the boxes. She was Catholic. She was royal. And so the deal was struck. He wrote to his mother, Sisi, a heartbreakingly honest letter. He confessed he was not in love, but that he found Stephanie good and sensible and believed that she could, in time, grow into the role. He was, in essence, trying to convince himself. He was sacrificing his personal heart for the good of the state, just as his father had always demanded. The engagement was announced. The machine of the state clanked forward. The wedding, in May 1881, was the spectacle of the decade. It was a massive display of Habsburg power and continuity. For a brief moment, all of Vienna celebrated. The emperor was happy. The succession was, seemingly, secure. But behind the facade, the marriage was a disaster from the very first night. Stephanie, completely unprepared by her mother or her convent teachers for the physical realities of marriage, was reportedly terrified. Rudolf, for his part, was not a patient or gentle man in this regard. He was a man of the world, with numerous mistresses, and he found his new wife's naivete to be more of an annoyance than a virtue. The honeymoon was a tense, awkward, and miserable affair. They returned to Vienna, and the cracks began to show immediately. Stephanie was plunged into the Hofburg Palace, a world she could not navigate. She was patronized by the sophisticated, cliquish Viennese aristocracy. She was looked down upon by her formidable mother-in-law, Empress Sisi, who found Stephanie dull and unintelligent and mockingly called her the little bumpkin. Sisi the rebel had no sympathy for this conventional, dutiful girl. Rudolf, for his part, tried. He really did at first. He tried to educate his new wife. He gave her books to read. He tried to explain his political ideas, but she wasn't interested. She couldn't understand him. He wanted to discuss the future of the empire. She wanted to discuss new furniture. He wanted to debate philosophy. She wanted to go to Mass. He was a fire. She was a stone. The chasm between them was absolute. And yet in 1883, a single brief ray of light. Stephanie gave birth to a child, a daughter. They named her Elizabeth, after Sisi, but she was known to the family as Ershi. She was a beautiful, healthy baby, and for a short time, the couple was united in genuine joy. Rudolf, in particular, adored his daughter. He was a doting, loving father. In Ershi, he found the one pure, uncomplicated human connection he had ever known. But this joy was poisoned by dynastic reality. She was a girl, and the empire, under its current laws, demanded a boy. The dynasty was still not secure. The pressure was back on. They had to try again. But the birth of Ershi would be the last happy moment in the marriage. The gulf between them had grown too wide. Rudolf, bored by his wife and politically neutered by his father, fell back into his old dark habits, but with a new, desperate vengeance. He began to drink heavily. He resumed his affairs, not with the intellectual companionship he sought from women, but in a frantic, almost nihilistic series of liaisons. He began to surround himself with a new, darker set of friends. Not the cafe intellectuals, but a vast crowd of dissolute aristocrats, all bent on the same path of self-destruction. He was, in short, spiraling. And it was here, in this dark period, that the final irreversible tragedy of his life occurred. It was a tragedy that would not only destroy his marriage, but would seal his personal doom. Sometime around 1885 or 1886, during one of his countless affairs, Crown Prince Rudolf contracted a venereal disease. It was almost certainly gonorrhea. In a world without antibiotics, this was a devastating diagnosis. But Rudolf, in his recklessness, did not stop. He went home to his wife, Princess Stephanie, and he infected her. The consequences were catastrophic. The infection for Stephanie was severe. It raged through her body, and it left her completely and permanently sterile. She could never have another child. Think about this. Think about the sheer crushing weight of this moment. Rudolf, the man whose one non-negotiable sacred dynastic duty was to produce a male heir, had just made it biologically impossible for his own wife to give him one. He had, with his own actions, personally severed the direct line of the Habsburg succession. For Stephanie, this was the ultimate betrayal. She was now a failed wife in constant physical pain from the chronic infection and trapped in a loveless, poisonous marriage with the man who had ruined her. Her bitterness and religious piety only hardened. For Rudolf, the guilt was overwhelming. But it was more than guilt, it was despair. He had failed as a politician, he had failed as a reformer, and now, thanks to his own personal demons, he had failed as an heir. The marriage was no longer a marriage, it was a tomb. The two lived in the same palace, but as complete strangers, communicating only through notes, their shared existence a living hell. Rudolf, now in his late 20s, was trapped. Politically powerless and plagued by chronic pain, he was, in every sense of the word, a dead man walking, and he was sinking deeper into an abyss of alcohol, depression, and a new, more dangerous escape, morphine. He was a man with no future, no purpose, and no hope. He was, in every sense of the word, a dead man walking. And it was from this dark, desperate place that he would begin his final fatal search for a way out. When we last saw Crown Prince Rudolf, he was a broken man, a man who had not only failed in his political ambitions, but had, through his own reckless actions, rendered his wife sterile, thereby failing in his single most sacred dynastic duty to produce a male heir. He was, in the cold, unforgiving eyes of the Habsburg court, and more importantly in the eyes of his father, a complete and total failure. He was now approaching 30. The charismatic, brilliant, forward-thinking young man was disappearing, buried beneath a mountain of pain. This pain was not just psychological, it was constant and physical. The venereal disease he had contracted, a ghost that would now haunt him and his wife forever, left him with chronic, agonizing symptoms. He suffered from blinding headaches, from rheumatism that plagued his joints, from a constant gnawing sickness. The vibrant intellectual was now a chronic patient, and in the 19th century, the cure for such chronic pain was as dangerous as the disease. His doctors, in an attempt to manage his suffering, prescribed the most potent drug in their arsenal, morphine. He was given injections. He was given laudanum. And very quickly, a man already dependent on alcohol to numb his political frustrations became a man addicted to morphine, to numb his physical body. He was now trapped in a vicious physiological spiral. The depression, the alcohol, the morphine, each one fed the other. His days became a fog of pain and drug-induced relief. His nights were a frantic, desperate search for any kind of escape, spent in the lowest taverns of Vienna, in the company of dissolute cab drivers and prostitutes, a world as far from the cold silence of the Hofburg Palace as he could possibly get. But his mind, that sharp, scientific, and restless mind, did not simply shut down. It turned inward, and it turned dark. Rudolf became obsessed with death. This was not just the passing melancholy of a poet like his mother. This was a deep, morbid, almost scientific fascination. He had always been a nihilist, a pessimist who believed in the grim, scientific materialism of the age. He believed, as many intellectuals did, that life was a chemical accident, that there was no God, no afterlife, only a cold, dark void. And now in his pain, that void began to look like a relief. It began to look like the only logical, rational solution. Death was not a tragedy, it was a liberation. He collected skulls and human bones. He wrote philosophical essays on the beauty of suicide. He would sit with his friends and calmly, rationally debate the best methods for ending one's own life. His bright, liberal dream for the empire had died, and in its place, a dark, personal obsession had been born. He didn't just want to die, he had convinced himself that death was the only noble, intelligent choice left. In this darkness, there was one person who was not a part of the suffocating court, nor a part of his new degenerate crowd. Her name was Mitzi Kaspar. Mitzi was, by trade, a fiacre millie, a high-class courtesan, one of the most famous and desired in Vienna. But for Rudolf, she was far more. She was perhaps the only truly honest relationship he had. Their affair had lasted for years. With Mitzi, he wasn't the crown prince. He wasn't a failure. He was just Rudy. He could take off the mask. He could complain about his father. He could weep about his failed marriage. He could speak of his fears and his pain. She was his confidant, his friend, his escape. He was deeply attached to her. He had even bought her a house, a small token of his gratitude and affection. And it was to Mitzi he went in the dark summer of 1888 with the most shocking proposal of his life. This is one of those hidden stories, a moment that completely shatters the romantic myth of Mayerling. One night in her apartment, Rudolf didn't just talk about his obsession with death. He asked her to join him. He didn't propose a new life. He proposed a double suicide. He wanted them to die together, to find that liberation in each other's arms. He had it all planned. They would drink champagne, take a fatal overdose of morphine, and simply slip away together. Mitzi Kaspar was no fool. She was a practical, worldly woman. She was not a 17-year-old girl with a head full of romantic novels. She saw this for what it was, not a romantic gesture, but a terrifying breakdown. She tried to laugh it off, to calm him down, but he was serious. He was deadly serious. She was so frightened by his cold, rational determination that the next day she did something incredibly brave and dangerous. She went to the Vienna police headquarters. She demanded to see the police president. And she told him, flat out, the Crown Prince is suicidal. He asked me to die with him. He is planning to kill himself. Think about this. A prostitute has just walked into police headquarters and accused the heir to the empire of being insane. What did the police do? Nothing. What could they do? They were terrified. They couldn't go to the emperor and tell him his son was mad. They couldn't arrest the crown prince. So they did what all bureaucracies do. When faced with an impossible truth, they buried it. They wrote a report, classified it, and dismissed Mitzi Kaspar as a hysterical woman, probably trying to get money. They wrote off the incident as the ramblings of a drunken officer. Rudolf had been planning his death for at least 6 months before Mayerling. He was actively searching for a partner, and he had been, in effect, ignored by the very state apparatus he was meant to one day command. Rebuffed by Mitzi, ignored by the police, Rudolf became even more desperate. He decided to make one last frantic attempt to change his life. If he couldn't change the empire, maybe he could at least change his own cage. He decided he would do the unthinkable. He would divorce Princess Stephanie. In the rigid, deeply Catholic Habsburg dynasty, this was not just a scandal. It was an impossibility. It was a rejection of a sacred dynastic sacrament. But Rudolf, in his new nihilistic state of mind, didn't care. He was going to free himself one way or another. And in his typical politically naive fashion, he made a catastrophic error. He didn't go to his father. He didn't try to negotiate. Instead, he secretly wrote a personal letter directly to Pope Leo XIII in the Vatican, formally petitioning for his marriage to be annulled. He went over his father's head straight to the only man on earth he saw as an equal power. The Vatican, of course, did not respond to Rudolf. It discreetly and immediately forwarded the Crown Prince's insane request to his father, Emperor Franz Joseph. The explosion was apocalyptic. The confrontation that followed in a cold private room in the palace was the final brutal end of their relationship. Franz Joseph, the man of iron duty, the man who had sacrificed his entire life to the idea of the monarchy, was incandescent with rage. This was not just a divorce request. This was treason. It was a public humiliation. His own son had tried to subvert him, to shame him, to dismantle the very foundations of their house. He screamed at Rudolf. He called him a disgrace, a failure, a degenerate. He accused him of being mad, of being worthless. And then he delivered his final crushing orders. There would be no divorce. There would never be a divorce. Rudolf was to end his disgusting public affairs. He was to return to his wife and do his duty, even if it was just for show. And he was explicitly, absolutely forbidden from ever seeing that prostitute, Mitzi Kaspar, again. This was the final blow. Stripped of his last comfort, his one true friend, Rudolf was trapped. Politically, dynastically, and personally, he was already dead. Leaving that room a condemned man, he knew with chilling certainty that there was no escape left in life. And it is in this exact moment, this precise vortex of absolute total despair, that a new character walks onto the stage. Her name was Baroness Mary Vetsera, and she was not Mitzi Kaspar. Mary was only 17 years old. She was not a hardened, practical woman of the world. She was the very opposite. She was a child of the new money aristocracy, a family that had been ennobled but was still desperate to climb into the highest, most exclusive circles of the Habsburg court. Her mother, Baroness Helene Vetsera, was a ruthlessly ambitious woman who had groomed her beautiful daughters for one purpose: to make spectacular, advantageous marriages. Mary herself was a girl of intense, almost feverish romanticism. She lived in a world of novels and operas, and she had, for a long time, nursed a massive, all-consuming schoolgirl crush on the Crown Prince. To her, Rudolf wasn't a sick, addicted, politically defeated man. He was a legend. He was the handsome, tragic, misunderstood, Byronic hero of her dreams. She collected photographs of him. She tracked his movements in the gossip columns. She dreamed of one day somehow meeting him. Their meeting was not an accident. It was arranged deliberately and secretively by one of the most notorious schemers in the court, Rudolf's cousin, Countess Marie Larisch. Marie, who was Cece's niece, was a confidant to both Rudolf and Mary's mother. Seeing an opportunity, she acted as the go-between. She smuggled letters back and forth, fanning the flames of Mary's obsession and piquing the interest of the bored, depressed prince. They finally met in secret in November 1888, just weeks after Rudolf's cataclysmic fight with his father. The affair was immediate, intense, and utterly clandestine. For Mary, it was the fantasy of a lifetime come true. The tragic prince, the heir to the empire, had chosen her. He was pouring out his heart to her, telling her how no one understood him, how he was trapped, how she was his only ray of light. She was overwhelmed, starstruck, and desperately in love. But for Rudolf, what did he see? She was not an intellectual partner like the journalists he admired. She was not a witty, earthy comfort like Mitzi. She was something new. She was young, she was beautiful, she was uncomplicated. And most importantly, after a lifetime of being told he was a failure by his father, here was a person who looked at him like he was a god. She didn't just love him, she worshipped him. Her adoration was a balm to his shattered ego, and she was a romantic, a true feverish romantic. When he began, as he inevitably did, to speak of his dark philosophies, of his obsession with death, of the liberation of the void, she didn't react like Mitzi with terror. She didn't go to the police. She listened wide-eyed. She was fascinated. She was in love with a tragic hero, and what in her mind was more tragically romantic than dying for love? Rudolf had been searching for a partner to join him in death. His practical mistress had refused. Now, in his darkest hour, the universe had delivered him the perfect, willing, and tragically naive candidate. The path to the hunting lodge at Mayerling was now clear. When we left our story, the fuse was lit. Crown Prince Rudolf, at 30 years old, was a man who had hit rock bottom. He was politically castrated by his father, trapped in a loveless marriage he had personally ruined and ravaged by chronic disease, alcohol, and morphine. His desperate, logical plea for a joint suicide had been rejected by his practical, long-term mistress, Mitzi Kasper. He was a man with a plan, but no partner. And then in November 1888, just as his final humiliating confrontation with his father had closed the last door, a 17-year-old girl stepped into the void. Her name was Baroness Mary Vitsera. She was not a pragmatist. She was a worshiper. She was a child who had nursed a celebrity crush on the tragic prince. And now he had turned his full, intense, desperate focus onto her. This is the story of their final 3 months. It is often painted as one of the great tragic love stories of history. But it was not a love story. It was a folie à deux, a madness of two. It was a dark, obsessive, and profoundly unequal pact between a man who had already decided to die and a child who was tragically willing to be convinced. Their affair, which lasted from November 1888 to the end of January 1889, was not a sweet, gentle courtship. It was a frantic, feverish, and all-consuming secret. They met in clandestine locations, arranged by Rudolf's cousin and Mary's friend, the ever-present schemer, Countess Marie Larisch. They met in Rudolf's private apartments at the Hofburg Palace, a place Mary, a minor baroness, should never have been able to enter. They met in the back of unmarked carriages, hidden from the prying eyes of the secret police who were always watching the Crown Prince. For Mary, this was the ultimate fantasy. She was the heroine of her own opera. The heir to the empire was risking everything to be with her. She was no longer just a girl. She was his destiny. She wrote to her friends in breathless, triumphant tones. She was reckless. She was a 17-year-old who had just won the ultimate prize, and she couldn't help but boast. But what did they talk about? What did this 30-year-old, deeply cynical, drug-addicted intellectual discuss with a 17-year-old girl with a convent education? He did not find his intellectual equal. He found something far more potent. He found a believer. He poured out his heart, his despair, his nihilistic philosophy. He told her how he was trapped, how his father was a tyrant, how his wife was a cold burden. He spoke of his sickness, his pain, and his profound bone-deep weariness with a world that had rejected all his ideas. And how did Mary react? She didn't recoil in fear like Mitzi Caspar. She didn't see a sick man in need of a doctor. She saw a tragic hero, a misunderstood genius, a kingly soul too pure for this world. She romanticized his every wound. His depression was profound sensitivity. His addiction was the mark of a tormented artist. And when he began to speak of his obsession with death, she saw it as the ultimate proof of his romantic soul. Their gifts to each other tell the entire story. He did not give her diamonds or pearls. He gave her a plain funereal iron ring like a wedding band, and he had it engraved with a line from a popular opera, "United in love until death." This was not a promise of a future life. It was a pledge for a shared grave. She, in return, gave him a gold cigarette case, a classic romantic token. But she had it engraved with a simple, powerful phrase, "In thanks to my destiny." She truly believed it was her fate to be with him. This exchange was the heart of their pact. In her mind, she was his true soulmate, the Isolde to his Tristan. And if the world would not let them be together in life, if his father, the king, forbade their love, then they would be united in the only way left to them. Death was not an end. It was their happily ever after. For Rudolf, a man who had been searching for a partner for his final act, this was perfect. He had found his co-star. Christmas 1888. This was the last time the imperial family would ever be together. We can only imagine the atmosphere. It was a feast of ghosts. Rudolf sat there, surrounded by the family that was the source of his entire life's misery. He looked at his father, the unbending tyrant. He looked at his wife, Stephanie, the living symbol of his greatest failure. He would have known with absolute certainty that this was his last one. The superficial polite speak, the exchange of expensive, meaningless gifts. It must have felt like a grotesque play. In these final weeks of 1888 and early January 1889, the pact was solidified. This was no longer just romantic, morbid talk. It became a plan. And Mary, far from being a reluctant victim, was an eager participant. She was terrified of losing him, terrified that he would be forced to break off their affair. In her mind, the only way to keep him forever was to die with him. She wrote him frantic, pleading letters, swearing she could not live without him, swearing her willingness to go anywhere with him, even into the grave. Rudolf's own behavior began to change. The frantic, nervous, agitated energy he had shown for years began to calm. This is a common and terrifying sign in those who have made a final, irreversible decision. The struggle is over. The what if is gone. All that remains is the how and the when. He had a purpose again. It was not to save the empire, but to exit it, cleanly and on his own terms. He began meticulously to put his affairs in order. This is the part of the story that proves beyond all doubt that this was a premeditated act, not a crime of passion. He wrote his will, leaving his personal possessions and money to his friends, his servants, and a large sum to his wife Stephanie, a final, cold, formal gesture. He began to say his goodbyes in his own coded way. He had a final, surprisingly civil dinner with his wife. He was polite, almost kind, a behavior so unusual that it baffled her. It was the calm of a man who no longer had to fight. He then did something truly haunting. He went to visit Mitzi Caspar, the woman who had refused to die with him. He didn't go to propose it again. He just went to sit with her. He spent a quiet evening, drinking champagne, listening to her play the zither. It was a melancholy, nostalgic visit. When he left, he placed a sealed envelope on her table. Inside, she would later find 60,000 gulden, a fortune. It was his pension, his goodbye to the one woman who had offered him friendship without fantasy. And then he wrote his farewell letters. These are the most heartbreaking pieces of evidence. He wrote a formal, almost cold note to his wife Stephanie, apologizing for the trouble he was causing and asking her to be kind to their daughter, Erzsi. He wrote a passionate, anguished, and deeply loving letter to his mother, Sisi. He poured out his heart, saying he was no longer worthy to live, that he was a failure, and that death was his only liberation. He told her he was calmer than he had been in years, and that she, his mother, was the only person who had ever truly understood him. He wrote a letter to his favorite sister, Marie Valerie, and significantly, to his friend Moritz Scheps, the liberal journalist, he wrote a final political testament lamenting the ruin of the empire and the triumph of his father's backward policies. There was one person he did not write a letter to, his father. To Emperor Franz Joseph, Rudolf left only silence. It was his final, most profound, and most devastating act of rebellion. While Rudolf was calmly planning his exit, the Vetsera household was exploding. Mary's recklessness had finally caught up with her. Her mother, the ambitious Baroness Helene, was no fool. She knew her daughter was having an affair, and an affair with the Crown Prince could be a social triumph, if handled correctly. But in mid-January, she realized this was not a normal affair. Mary was obsessed, hysterical, and constantly talking in dark, romantic death and destiny terms. Helene's social triumph was turning into a social catastrophe. She confronted Mary. There were terrible screaming rows. Mary was, in effect, placed under house arrest. Helene tried to separate them, to get Mary out of Vienna, but it was too late. Then came the final trigger. On January 28, 1889, Rudolf had one last terrible confrontation with his father. The emperor had finally been warned. We don't know if it was from the police or from Rudolf's own wife Stephanie, who was by now deeply suspicious. But Franz Joseph knew something was afoot with that Vetsera girl. He confronted his son, and he gave him a direct, ironclad order, just as he had with Mitzi Kaspar. You will end this affair immediately. He commanded Rudolf to join him and the Empress for a hunting trip to get him away from Vienna, away from the girl. Rudolf, the man who had been ordered around his entire life, calmly agreed. He said, "Yes, father." He would go hunting, but he would not be going with his father. He would be going to Mayerling. The order from his father was the signal. It was now. He sent a secret final message to Mary, delivered by his loyal valet, Bratfish. The plan, which they must have rehearsed, was set in motion. On the morning of January 28th, Mary Vetsera played her part. She told her frantic mother she wanted to go shopping. To make it believable, she asked her friend, Countess Marie Lariche, to chaperone her. The long-suffering countess, trapped between her two friends, agreed. They went to a shop in the center of Vienna, and then it happened. While the countess was momentarily distracted, Mary Vetsera, who was wearing heavy traveling clothes under her coat, simply bolted. She ran out of the shop into the street where an unmarked carriage, the Crown Prince's fiacre, was waiting. She jumped in. The door slammed, and the carriage sped away, disappearing into the Vienna traffic. Mary's mother was frantic. She and the police searched the city, but it was useless. Mary had vanished. She had eloped with the heir to the throne. Rudolf picked her up, and they traveled together to the train station. From there, they took the train to Baden, and then another carriage, driven by his valet, on the final leg. They arrived at the small, remote hunting lodge of Mayerling in the late afternoon. It was cold, it was silent, and it was completely cut off from the world. That night, Rudolf had ordered a small private dinner. He had two friends, Count Hoyos and Prince Coburg, who were to join him for a hunt the next day, staying in a separate wing of the lodge. To them he was in high spirits. He drank champagne, he laughed, he told jokes. He was the perfect host. He explained that his guest, Mary, was a new friend who was feeling unwell and was staying in her room. After dinner, he bade his friends good night, telling them he would see them for the hunt in the morning. He then retired to his private apartments where Mary was waiting. The door was locked. The servants were dismissed. After a lifetime of being spied on, of being ordered, of being trapped by the world, Crown Prince Rudolf was, for the first time, and the last time, completely and totally alone. When we left them, the door was locked. The world was shut out. Crown Prince Rudolf, 30 years old, and Baroness Mary Vetsera, 17, were alone in the private apartments of a remote, snowbound hunting lodge. It was the night of January 29th, 1889. What happened in those final silent hours is the very heart of the mystery, a tragedy that would be pieced together from scraps of evidence, frantic half-truths, and the cold, hard facts of the following morning. In the other wing of the lodge, Rudolf's hunting guests, Count Hoyos and Prince Coburg, had no reason to suspect anything. The Crown Prince had been a charming, witty host, explaining that his young companion was feeling unwell. They went to bed, expecting a hunt at dawn. But in Rudolf's apartments there was no pretense left. This was not a hunt. It was an execution. We know that Rudolf's loyal fiacre, carriage driver and valet, Joseph Bratfish, was with them for part of the evening. Bratfish was one of Rudolf's fast crowd friends, a man from the common people with whom Rudolf felt he could be himself. He was ordered to play the zither and sing, to provide a soundtrack of forced cheerfulness, a last thin veneer of normalcy over the abyss. Imagine that scene, the wind howling outside, a teenage girl who believed she was in the middle of the greatest love story of her life, and a sick, addicted man who had meticulously planned his own oblivion. And in the corner, a servant playing folk songs, pretending not to see the tension, the despair, or perhaps the gun that Rudolf had brought with him. They reportedly drank champagne. They wrote their final frantic postscripts to the world. Mary herself wrote a final breathless and chilling letter to her mother, saying she was happier than she had ever been, and that she could not live without him. Sometime late into the night, Rudolf finally dismissed Bratfish. He told him to go to bed, that he would be called in the morning. Bratfish left, and then there was only silence. We will never know the exact sequence of events. We will never know their final words. But the forensic evidence, pieced together later, paints the most likely and most brutal picture. This was not a simultaneous romantic pact where they drank poison and drifted off. This was a murder and a suicide. At some point in those pre-dawn hours, Rudolf picked up his revolver. He aimed it at Mary Vetsera's head at her left temple, and he fired a single shot. She was likely asleep, or perhaps willingly, terrifyingly, waiting for it. She died instantly, and then Rudolf waited. This is the most haunting part. He did not immediately turn the gun on himself. The evidence suggests that hours passed. He sat there in the silent room with the body of the 17-year-old girl he had just killed. What did he do? Did he drink? Did he take morphine? Did he write one last unseen note? Did he finally feel the crushing absolute weight of what he had done? We can only imagine the state of his mind, the cocktail of drugs, alcohol, disease, and despair, as he sat in the dark, next to his liberation. Finally, as the first cold gray light of dawn began to creep through the window, Rudolf picked up the revolver again. He was a scientist and a hunter. He knew anatomy. He put the barrel to his own right temple, aimed precisely, and pulled the trigger. The Crown Prince who chose death over empire was no more. The morning of January 30th, 1889. Dawn broke. Rudolf's personal valet, Loschek, came to the door to wake his master for the hunt. He knocked. There was no answer. He knocked again, louder. Silence. He called out silence. He tried the handle. The door was locked from the inside. A cold dread began to set in. Loschek knew his master's moods. He knew about the prince's morbid talk. He went and got the hunting guests, Count Hoyos and Prince Coburg. They too called out. They banged on the door. The only sound that came back was the mournful howling of Rudolf's hunting dog, trapped somewhere inside the apartments. Panic. They shouted to Loschek, "Find an axe, break it down." The valet, frantic, ran and returned with a heavy axe. He began to smash at the thick oaken door, the sound echoing through the silent lodge. The lock finally splintered, and the door burst open. Loschek was the first one in. The scene that met his eyes would be burned into history. The room was dark, the shutters still closed. The air was thick with the smell of a freshly fired gun. Rudolf was not in bed. He was slumped forward, half sitting, half lying, at the edge of his bed. His upper body was on the nightstand, his head resting in a pool of blood. In his hand, which lay on the stand, was the revolver. Beside him, a glass of water, untouched. He was dead. And then Loschek. And Count Hoyos, peering over his shoulder, saw the bed. Lying on the sheets as if she were asleep was Mary Vetsera. She was on her back, her hands, as it was later reported, clasped in front of her, perhaps holding a single wilted rose. She too was dead. The reaction was not sorrow. It was sheer, unadulterated horror. This was not a double suicide. This was a disaster. This was a state crisis. Count Hoyos, a seasoned diplomat, immediately understood. This wasn't a tragedy. It was an unmanageable scandal. The Crown Prince, heir to the apostolic majesty, had just murdered a 17-year-old baroness and then killed himself. What followed was not a process of grief. It was an act of pure, desperate, and ultimately failed public relations. The Habsburg machine lurched into motion, not to find out why this had happened, but to contain it. Step 1, the lie. Count Hoyos, his face ashen, did not call the local police. He commandeered the imperial train at the nearest station and raced back to Vienna. He went straight to the Hofburg Palace. He lied. He couldn't bring himself to tell the truth. He told the emperor's aides that the crown prince had died suddenly, probably of a heart attack or apoplexy, a stroke. Step 2, the messenger. The aides, terrified, didn't know how to tell the emperor. They went to the one person who had always been the emotional core of the family, the one person who despised the court, but was, strangely, the strongest of all, Empress Sisi. They brought Sisi into a room and told her the first lie. Her son was dead. Sisi, who had been dreading a moment like this her entire life, collapsed, but only for a moment. And it was she, his estranged, heartbroken mother, who had to walk down the cold palace corridor, enter the emperor's study, and tell her husband, Franz Joseph, that their only son was gone. Step 3, the truth. Franz Joseph was stunned, but the heart attack story didn't hold up. A second messenger arrived from Mayerling. This one carried the truth. He carried Rudolf's farewell letter to his mother, Sisi. Sisi read the letter, a final, loving, desperate confession from her son. And she knew. It wasn't a heart attack. She had to go back to her husband a second time. She had to tell him, "Our son did not die. He killed himself." And then the final devastating blow. The full report came in. He was not alone. He had murdered a 17-year-old girl first. Franz Joseph, the man of iron duty, the man who lived by the rules of God and the state, completely broke. His first reported words were not of grief, but of rage and shame. He reportedly exclaimed, "How could he do this? He has died like a like a tailor. He was horrified not just by the sin, but by the shame, the vulgarity, the disorder of it all. Step 4, the cover-up. The machine went into overdrive. The first priority was Rudolf. The second was the dynasty. The last priority, the one that was nothing more than a grotesque inconvenience, was Mary Vetsera. For Rudolf, the problem was burial. He was a suicide and a murderer. In the eyes of the Catholic Church, he was damned. He could not be buried in the imperial crypt with his ancestors. For the emperor, this was the final unbearable humiliation. So the state did what it does best. It created a new truth. A state medical commission was hastily assembled. They were ordered to find a medical, not a moral reason. Within hours, they produced a report. The Crown Prince, they declared, had been suffering from a temporary fit of madness, a mental aberration that had impaired his free will. It was a legal fiction. He was not a sinner. He was ill. This diagnosis, a lie forged by the state, was enough for the church. It allowed Rudolf to be given a full state funeral and buried as a Habsburg in the crypt. The honor of the dynasty was preserved. But what about Mary Vetsera? Her story is the true hidden horror of Mayerling. She was not a person. She was a problem. She was evidence of the dynasty's shame, and she had to be erased. Baroness Helene, Mary's frantic mother, was summoned by the police. She was not told her daughter was dead. She was simply told she was at Mayerling and that she must be retrieved quietly. But by the time she got there, it was too late. The cover-up was already in motion. Mary's uncles were summoned to the lodge by the Prime Minister. They were shown the body and given their orders. Remove her, now, in secret, and no one must ever know. What followed is something out of a horror novel. On the night of January 31st, 2 days after her death, Mary's uncles took her body, which was now in rigor mortis. They dressed her in her coat and hat. To get her out of the lodge and into a waiting carriage without the driver noticing, they propped her, fully clothed, between them. As one of them later confessed, they may have even put a broomstick or a cane up the back of her dress to keep her body sitting upright, as if she were merely ill or drunk. They drove her, this grotesque puppet of a dead girl, through a dark and rainy night to the tiny Cistercian monastery at Heiligenkreuz. There, in a corner of the graveyard, a simple, unmarked grave had been dug. With no priest, no ceremony, and no family, Mary Vetsera was dumped into the wet earth. Her family was forbidden from visiting the grave. They were forbidden from mourning her. Her mother was forced into exile. The Habsburg state had not just killed her, it had annihilated her, erasing her from history. While Mary was being buried like a criminal, Rudolf was being celebrated as a fallen angel. His funeral was a massive public spectacle. The official story, the fit of madness, had transformed him into a tragic romantic figure. The public, who had loved him, wept for their lost people's prince. They didn't know the full truth. They didn't know about the murder, the addiction, or the political despair. They just saw a dream that had died. And what of his parents? For Empress Sisi, this was the end. Her restless, melancholy spirit was finally completely shattered. She put away her magnificent gowns and wore only black for the rest of her life. She was no longer an empress. She was a woman in mourning, the Mater Dolorosa of Europe. She fled Vienna and never truly returned, wandering the world. A ghost haunted by the sun, she felt she had both understood and failed. Her own tragic end would come 9 years later, when she herself was assassinated, a death she almost seemed to welcome. And Franz Joseph, the Iron Man of Austria, he went back to work. That was the only thing he knew how to do. He went back to his desk, to his papers, to his duty. He locked away his grief. He never spoke of Rudolf again. He would go on to rule for another 27 years, a lonely, archaic-looking old man, a living relic of a bygone era, working tirelessly to hold together an empire that was now, without question, doomed. But Rudolf's life had ended. The global catastrophe he unleashed was just beginning. With Rudolf gone, the direct line of succession was broken. The crown now had to pass to Franz Joseph's younger brother, who then renounced it. And so, it passed to his son, a man who was, in many ways, the opposite of Rudolf. He was conservative, famously short-tempered, deeply religious, and widely disliked. His name was Archduke Franz Ferdinand. This is the final devastating irony. The death of Rudolf, the liberal, progressive, anti-German, pro-French reformer, directly led to the ascension of Franz Ferdinand, a man who embodied the old, rigid system. And it would be the assassination of this new heir, Franz Ferdinand, in the city of Sarajevo in 1914, that would directly trigger the German alliance that Rudolf had so desperately warned against. That single shot at Sarajevo lit the fuse for World War I, but it was the shot Rudolf fired at Mayerling 25 years earlier that had, in effect, loaded the gun. By killing himself, Rudolf didn't just end his own life. He killed the one alternative future his empire had. He killed the dream of a peaceful, federal, reformed United States of Austria. He left his father's dying empire in the hands of the very traditionalists he had spent his life fighting. Why, then, does this story still haunt us? Why does Mayerling remain a place of dark pilgrimage? Because the truth of the Mayerling incident is not found in the endless tabloid conspiracy theories that Rudolf and Mary were murdered by German agents or by his father's secret police. Those theories only exist because the Habsburg cover-up was so clumsy, so cruel, and so desperate that it invited suspicion. The real tragedy is not a conspiracy. It's something far more human. It's a story about the crushing, unbearable weight of destiny. It's about the eternal, unwinnable war between the rigid expectations of an old world and the desperate, flawed desires of a new generation. Rudolf was not a simple hero. He was a brilliant, progressive, and deeply flawed man. He was a visionary who was also an addict. He was a reformer who was also a romantic. He was a man who saw the 20th century with perfect clarity, but was emotionally and physically destroyed by the 19th. He was, in the end, a prince who had all the right ideas for his empire, but none of the answers for himself. He couldn't save his world, and in the end, he couldn't even save himself. He was the future that never was, a dream of a modern Austria that died with him in the silence of a cold, dark Durham.